Hello folks, how you doing? You all right? Good. Nice to be back, actually, at Confetti. Always get a warm welcome when I find myself here. But today, yes, something very special. With over 15 million albums sold worldwide, Faithless are rightly viewed as one of the UK's finest electronic artists, and producer, songwriter, DJ, broadcaster and composer Sister Bliss was absolutely central to all of that success. And today I'm delighted that she's agreed to join us here at Confetti. So please give her a warm welcome, Sister Bliss. Hey, come on in. Make yourself at home.
Oh, thank you so much. What a lovely welcome.
Yes. So, wow, what a journey you've had. It's been quite something. I wonder if we can sort of scroll back and kind of figure out what some of the start points were for this amazing journey that you've been on. So I'm interested to know sort of when you first started engaging with music and when you heard music and thought, oh, this is good and this is exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to grow up in the 80s, so synthesizers and drum machines were invented, and I was just fascinated with anything that sounded like it came from the future. And somehow when house music was born, 1987, I was 17, starting to explore the world and go to clubs. So there was this synergy, this explosion of this electronic music, and it just spoke to me deeply. I was collecting vinyl as well. I'd buy lots of albums, lots of 12 inches, and I was absolutely obsessed with this new sound, acid house. And I heard it mixed up with other 80s music, like 12 inches of Prince and Madonna. I used to go to some quite eclectic clubs, and then this new sound that was so uncompromising, it just blew my mind. And I went on a pilgrimage to find it anywhere I could, basically.
You went on a pilgrimage. I thought you were going to say I went on a pill.
Well, that came a bit later.
Did
but
it?
Yeah.
And were you DJing at this point when you were like 17, 18 and this whole...
No, I was making mixtapes because I didn't have much money, so I had a friend who was similarly excited by acid house and pirate radio. She would buy one record, I would buy another one. We'd put together our tunes on each side of a tape. So I'd have her collection on one side of the tape and my collection on the other side. So it was a kind of very rudimentary DJing with no mixing. Just trying to double our record collection between us.
And what about the making of music and your knowledge of music? Were you sort of classically trained in your school days?
Yes, so I was, but I always loved pop music. I had piano lessons and I was in orchestras and things like that, and I absolutely loved it. I loved being in amongst music, but I was never dedicated enough. I mean, there were people in my orchestras and at school who were playing concertos when they were 12 years old, and that just wasn't my work. I'm really not technically very accomplished at all.
Well, that's an interesting thing to hear.
Yeah, I mean, but, you know, house music, it's a bit less complex, isn't it?
And quite encouraging, actually, you know, that because some people have this view, oh, you've got to be an absolute wizard with, you know, technical stuff or whatever to have success. And
yeah, I had a musical ear, and I think that did give me an advantage, and it certainly does as a DJ. I do put my sets together in a really musical way. I know when the keys clash and it sounds horrible. You know, I do have a sense of rhythm, although I have to count really hard not to come in the wrong place when I was doing live shows.
Yeah.
But obviously it's very different writing your own music with a band and playing a classical piece of music with the music in front of you. So it was a different skill set, really. Writing and performing are two different things, and I was lucky enough to write and perform my own music eventually. But I was always interested in making little tunes on synthesizers. So I guess my love of 80s music and then the explosion of acid house kind of coalesced in me. I basically met a bloke in Camden Market who sold me an Atari, and I taught myself how to use it in a day and I had a little keyboard, and I started making tunes in my mum's bedroom with a doof, 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 doof beat, trying to emulate what I'd heard on these early Chicago house records. So that's how it all began, really.
Fantastic. And do you remember the first time that one of these sort of bedroom type productions actually sort of turned into a release.
Absolutely. I made a demo. I didn't actually... I had a tape recorder. Somehow I made the demo in mono. It wasn't even in stereo. And I was a massive raver. I used to go out clubbing all the time, and I knew a lot of people from the scene. And I ran into someone who actually released a very pivotal record, Candy Staton and the Sauce. And he just started a label in Camden Town, which was an offshoot of Food. Food had signed Blur. Probably heard of Blur, big band.
We've all heard of Blur, haven't we?
And they had a very small label called Synthetic, which was a dance label. And they just signed Goldie, but basically me at the same time. I ran into this guy who I knew from raving. I said, I'm making tunes. And he said, we'll give you some free studio time. They had a studio in Camden. And I went in with an engineer and just noodled away and made my first ever record, which was actually under the name Miss Bliss. Can't remember why I didn't call myself Sister Bliss on that particular record. I was Ms. Bliss. And that was my first ever release. And around the very same time, I met a guy in a record shop over a pile of vinyl. I said, I've got an Atari and a keyboard. Should we make a tune? And we made a record together, and his best friend was a producer called Rollo. And I started playing keyboards for Rollo and doing remixes and making records with him. And the very same friend that I met in a record shop introduced us to Maxi, a Buddhist rapper from Brixton. And that's how Faithless began. It really was all these kind of crazy little coincidences, getting excited about music, having conversations, chatting away over piles of records, swapping information about what track was hot and what track wasn't. And that was the beginning of a conversation that's now lasted over 30 years. So really it was just us being enthusiastic about clubbing and about music and about the whole scene and being excited and going on an adventure trying to make it myself.
And in those early days of before Faithless, when you were just having a track out here and a track out there, did you have a team around you at that point? Manager, agent, any of this sort of stuff?
No, not at all. In the beginning, it really was just going up to people and trying to give them a record and saying, "I've made a record, would you play it?" So if you hang around in certain clubs long enough, you can get to know the DJs. A lot of people will go up now with a little USB drive. Reach out on Instagram. We live in a very different world now, but really a person-to-person approach was quite powerful back in the day. And also, if you were a DJ, you were on promo lists where you knew about 20 DJs, people like Carl Cox, Fatboy Slim, Paul Oakenfold. If they played your tune, it was very likely that your record would break, as the term was then, i.e. hit critical mass. It's a very different picture these days. So I had a real person-to-person approach in my early days. And I was begging agents to take me on because I was desperate to DJ.
Were you nervous when you were approaching people saying, "Hey, I've made this record," or were you natural?
Can't remember. I think I was quite overexcited and excitable. And... yeah.
Well, you've got to believe in yourself, haven't you? I think that's one important thing. If you're not prepared to start those conversations, why should you expect anybody else to start them on your behalf? So if you're not prepared to say, take an opportunity to say, "Hey,
Absolutely.
Perhaps you might like to have a listen to this. It's something I've worked on." Then I mean, this is my view. I think that artists need to create their own momentum, and then things happen. They can't just think,
agreed.
"Oh, if I have the right manager, then everything will all fall into place," or if I have the right record label, they'll do all of that. I don't personally think that's how it works.
Well, that wasn't my journey. We released music on a completely independent label that my musical partner in Faithless, Rollo, co-owned. We were so disorganised. Our first ever record we made together just sat in boxes in my living room. We were rubbish at getting it distributed. In those days, you'd put bags of records on different vans that went all around the countries, and different record shops would say, "Oh, I'll take 10 of them, I'll take 20 of them, take 5 of them." And that's how you got your records distributed all around the UK and beyond. It really was a very analogue world that we lived in back then. But really for me, making music was because I wasn't doing very well with DJing. I'd made tapes, I started DJing, I was at university in Birmingham, although I actually dropped out because I had a hit record and I'm deferred. I could go back at any time, so they tell me. So I was at Birmingham and I started DJing, and I got a couple of gigs in London, and it just accelerated and snowballed from there. And then there were some sticky bits. You thought, God, how am I going to get noticed? And I thought about the DJs that I really admired and followed, and they all had labels, and they were making music. You know, people like Todd Terry and Masters at Work, these sort of gods of house music. And really that was what kind of prompted me to get in the studio. And this chance meeting with a real wide boy off of Pirate Radio in Camden Market, who said, I can sell you an Atari for 100 quid. And I was like, all right, that sounds quite good.
It
really was just ridiculous sort of accidents that happened.
But you've got to sort of seize those moments, haven't you? Perhaps
Very much so, yeah.
You know, if an opportunity presents itself, maybe one of the key things is like being able to go, no, I should be buying an Atari now. That's the right thing for me to be doing, or having that belief to think, I should be. Either back in those days getting some white labels pressed up, or perhaps now it's, I should be putting some music on SoundCloud, or I should be. Yeah,
I mean, there was a culture, there was a real DIY culture back in the day where people did press up their own records, go to pressing plants with a cassette even, and then turn it into a record, so that it was possible to do it without the big machinery of a record label. And again, I think the same thing sort of applies today with the internet now, is that you can market yourself, you can put your music up without the mechanics of a label. Although it's difficult to get reach. But as I say, the way I disseminated my music back in the day was with very small dance labels here and there, also just accelerating, saying yes to every gig that came in, driving myself up and down the motorways of England. I didn't even have a driver for years, which is sort of ridiculous when I think about how exhausted I was. Really mad, but that's youth as well. Maybe I wasn't tired at all because I was in my 20s and wildly excited. But there wasn't a roadmap like there is now. I was just sort of looking around. I was into hardcore rave and break beats, and just looking at how people put music out, and just kind of followed that trajectory, really.
So let's have a little piece of music. Maybe we can have a listen to "Can't Get a Man, Can't Get a Job," which was really the first time that you entered into the sort of national charts, wasn't it? It was your personal kind of breakthrough.
Well, actually, just before that, when I met Rollo, we did a series. The gig was that I do one for him. He wanted to do a series of records called Rollo Goes. These were all just one-off dance records. First one was called Rollo Goes Camping. Second one was called Rollo Goes Mystic. Then there was a Rollo Goes Spiritual. And in between each Rollo Goes, we do a Sister Bliss track. It's a sort of, one for you, one for me. Then we met Maxi, and then it was, let's do a Faithless. What should we call this new sort of one-off dance record?
Teamwork.
And that was Faithless. Yeah, so this was a very, very early one where it got to like 28 or 29, or maybe even 31 in the charts. So Rollo Goes Mystic got in the charts first, then Sister Bliss went up a bit further.
This kind of like got your name into the mainstream a little bit. So if we can have a little listen to 30 seconds of that would be great. I think that's great.
It was very camp.
Round of applause for that.
I'd started DJing
Yeah.
in the gay clubs in London. The gay clubs were the places that accepted me. There were a handful of female DJs back in the early 90s. There really wasn't the sort of representation that there is now. And they were very welcoming. And, well, you know, really, what can I say? People come, oh, girl, you've got to come play my club. And then suddenly, this was in my second year of university, being back in London, making tunes. I got 2 residencies at 2 really important clubs. I just thought, oh my God, how am I going to go back to university? I've got a record in the charts, and oh my God. And really it accelerated from that point onwards. I gave myself a year to do well, and I never went back.
Fantastic. That's amazing.
And about 2 years after that, it was about 94, we met Max. So I think it was around 91, 92, So we were making lots and lots of dance records, and working with Rollo, we became a really powerful remix team as well. So Rollo and Sister Bliss became quite a big stamp of quality in the world of remixes in the 90s. We had quite a big epic sound even then. Although I would say the music was much more what one would call handbag, as in it was quite positive and boisterous, and it had a grandeur to it. But it wasn't the kind of serious message in music that we found when we met Maxi. And we were starting to get frustrated with dance music, that it felt really disposable. It was just about partying. It was a bit mindless. And we always had this feeling about the unifying part of dance music that really brings people together, and that there was something, you know, spiritual about it, and beyond race and gender, and that those moments were often quite naive, but there are certain house records that were really, really key for myself and Rollo, and we wanted to have those records that would connect in that really universal way. And when we met Maxi, we were going through this period of feeling dance music. It was, really but pretty shallow and a bit almost tedious and stale. It had become a bit stale. And in Maxi, we found someone who had a lyrical agenda, had something to say about the world and the human condition, which we were feeling, and he put our feelings into words in a really powerful, poignant way. You know,
so
took it to a darker, deeper place.
Did you actively kind of think, what we need is to find a rapper? Yeah, now what rapper can we find? Or did you just sort of meet Maxi and kind of think, oh, wow, this is what we need? I'm wondering whether you kind of architected.
Maybe we asked the universe and the universe provided, but the actual thing that happened was we were so sort of we're not the most technical people in the world, but we found a button on the Atari that made things slow down. We thought, God, that's really exciting. We can have a track and it starts at 126 BPM and then it can go really slow. A bit like there's an archetypal house track, Little Louis French Kiss, which slowed down in the middle and then speeded up. But we didn't know how to do that technically. We were all about the sound of things, but we weren't actually very technically adept. We were so excited. We did this track and it felt like it had something to it. And then Rollo slowed the middle down. We thought, we should go and get a rapper because it sounds like hip-hop in the middle. And then a friend of ours, the first guy that I met that I made music with, came to the studio and said, I've met a Buddhist rapper from Brixton. And he said, let's get him for that bit in the middle that slows down. I mean, it was that sort of banal.
Tremendous.
And the universe did deliver. But as I say, at that time, there was this energy. Left Field had brought out this amazing band. They brought out a seminal album called Leftism, which kind of really showed you that dance music could work across an album and be really poignant and meaningful and banging and intimate all at the same time. So there were certain bands that were making dance music albums, and we felt we had something to express that went beyond the single. And now it's really weird. We're all trying to cram our music into 3 minutes because the algorithms say that people don't even listen past 2 minutes 50. And we wanted something big and sprawling, and Faithless became the vehicle for wanting to express everything that was in our musical kind of DNA.
Did you have long-term aspirations for Faithless at that point, or did you think it'd be nice to make a couple of big tracks?
We actually got together to make one track.
One track.
Because we'd done these Rollo Goes Camping and Sister Bliss tracks, we were very used to the dance music format, which is just you put out a track, then you put out another track. Dance music wasn't known for its kind of album artists, let's say, really until sort of Left Field and Underworld came along. So really we got together with Maxi thinking he's just one of those people that comes down the studio like all the other singers we've worked with. But he was so interesting and the conversations we had were so philosophical that we wanted to take it further. But actually, we only did one record and it was called Salva Mea, and it got signed by Island. Nobody really knows this. We got signed by Island Records, which is the home of U2, Bob Marley, some of the biggest artists in the world. And it sat on a shelf. We're like, oh my God, the record's been signed by a major, it's really exciting. They just didn't know what to do with it because it was sort of house, then it was hip hop, and then it was house again at the end. So it sort of... And it was really dark, and it was quite intense as a piece of music. Like, it was probably undanceable. I mean, I do see people jumping up and down to it, but, like, actually kind of busting a move. It was quite an uncompromising piece of music. So we sat on a shelf for 6 months, and at the end of that period, we were like, we don't release music to have it sitting on a shelf. This is ridiculous. Why don't we put it out on Rollo's label, Cheeky, which we'd been doing all these other tunes on, which was an independent dance label at the time. Anyway, at that point, we said, look, Max, we've done this track and they haven't released it. We're going to put it out ourselves, but why don't we do some more music together? And the first album, Reverence, came out, together in 17 days. Let's make it like a mixtape. Remember I talked about mixtapes, what I did, with my mate to double our record collection. So we conceived the first album as a mixtape. A bit of reggae, bit of house, bit of hip-hop, our favourite music, bringing together all of our influences, because it wasn't like we all met at school. Maxie was a bit older. He was in like 37 when we first met. So he'd been around the block. He'd been in like acid jazz bands. He was signed to acid jazz for a bit. He'd done some hip house on Tam Tam, which is a seminal label like, remember Homeboy Hippie and a Funky Dread? So he was a Brixton musician who'd done bits and bobs here and there. He was also touring with an amazing jazz musician called Jason Rebello, who was a keyboard player, and Jar Wobble as well. So Maxie had been around, and he just thought, these sort of odd people that want me to come and rap on a house tune. And he was like, all right, nothing ventured, nothing gained. None of us had done an album at this point, so it was very, very naive. And he was just up for it. So we were like, let's do it. Let's do a mixtape. You love hip-hop, you love reggae, Rollo loves reggae. Maxie and I love Joni Mitchell and jazz, as well as early house. Maxie didn't stop liking house after about 1989. So, but, we were a very groove and beat-driven band, for sure.
I had no idea that Salvamia was signed to Island and sat on the shelf. So actually, can we have a little listen to a little blast of Salvamia, which was the initial breakthrough point for Faithless?
Take a look at the world behind these eyes. Every nook, every penny reorganized. Realize my facts don't fit the way I feel. What's real? I need a mirror to check my face is in place in case of upheaval. Fundamental movement below. What's really going on? I wanna know, but we don't show on the outside.
Okay, Salvamia.
That was the middle bit.
That was the middle bit.
Without the bangy bit.
Yeah. So then the first album starts coming together. Did you say that the album was made in 17 days?
Yeah, it was. That's because that's all the studio time we could afford.
So
we didn't have any money as well, so it's a big decider what you do as an artist.
This is really interesting. So did you just know, right, we've got 17 days, so we do this track, for 2 days, that for 1 day? Was it something like that?
I can't remember how the time was apportioned. I know, so Rollo had a studio in a garden shed in Islington, and we did the demos in there. So I'd just come in and play keyboards, and we'd just riff, and we'd, I have to say, smoke quite a lot and just chat on life. We'd ask Max about his philosophy, because he's a major Buddhist, a real Buddhist, as in practicing it as a religion. And he had a lot of thoughts on karma, why things happen to people. Why do bad things happen in the world? Is there a God? And we'd have conversations, then we'd say, well, put that in a lyric. And we'd always be looking for grooves and bass lines that would excite him as well. Often we'd write around a sample. So Rollo had some favourite old school reggae tunes, and we basically sampled them, and then I'd play new music around the samples, and he'd be like, I love that sample, love that tune, and we'd write a new song. So we did have to pay for some of the samples. There's a couple of bits on Reverence that are based around old school reggae samples.
I mean, one thing that I've seen people do, which is quite interesting, is sort of write a song around a familiar instrumental, and then bin the familiar instrumental, create completely new music, so that when the record comes out, you can't tell that the start point was sample-based. But kind of subconsciously almost, there's something in the DNA of the record that was a massive hit, because the top line, fitted with a familiar with an instrumental that had been really big, and that's quite an interesting thing. So sometimes you can leave the sample in that familiar bass line, sometimes bin it. There's various ways, isn't there?
It's one of those things. If you have what you call writer's block, it's a great prompt. If you guys are in the studio at all, it's quite nice. You can listen to one of your favourite records if you like the chord sequence, and just take the chord sequence and maybe just change a couple of notes. I mean, it's sort of cheating, but it isn't. Everything comes from somewhere. Everything's inspired by something. But you do end up, if you do actually use a sample, you have to clear it. You have to go through the relevant paths, and that can be quite difficult and painstaking, and you lose a lot of publishing, which is your writing on the track. So often we've got more canny to it now, but we don't. I mean, actually, there's somewhere the sample is so integral to the track. It's the making of it, and it's a wonderful and joyous process. And sometimes it alerts people to music that they wouldn't have otherwise heard. So on our third album, we had a song called Muhammad Ali, because Maxie's a massive boxing fan. And we used a sample from an old Motown sample from Archie Bell and the Drells, and the track was called Strategy. And it was, what do you call it, a dead copyright. Nobody was interested in that track. And we kind of fought with the label to clear the sample and say, look, we're putting it in the into the hearts and minds of a completely different generation. We're bringing this music that was sort of sitting in a vault and no one gave a shit about into the public consciousness, because they wanted 100% of the publishing, and we're like, no, but we've written a completely different song over it. We've only used 40 seconds or whatever. And actually, we did quite a good deal on it. I think we used a sample from Ian Dury and the Blockheads on one of our albums as well. But again, we wrote completely different, music, a rap over the top. Lots of rappers will do that. They'll use samples, won't they? Very famous samples. But, I mean, the original music is generally what Faithless is about. So
speaking about the original music that Faithless is about, you managed to create something that had a real kind of unique sort of audio character to it. Was that also your aim? Or did you sort of did the records just end up sounding unique? Or were you like, how do we make a record that has a unique personality? I mean, those records, they sounded like Faithless records. They didn't sound really like anything else. I thought it was really impressive, the way that you just sort of, had your own sound. So again, I'm interested in knowing if you really architected it or whether you just sort of fell into it a little bit.
I think the thing with Faithless was, because the genres were so diverse that we made music in, it wasn't just four to the floor, big club dance records. There was this sort of reggae and tinges of ambient and even folk music. To create something coherent in the production, that did take work. Sometimes it's to do with the palette of sounds you use, sometimes to do with the chords. I make all the music, so it is all coming out of me, apart from when we use a sample. So I guess there's something in me and the way I play the piano that lends itself to it having, I can only work within my limits. I'm not a brilliant keyboard player by any stretch of the imagination. But I guess that gives it a coherency. Of course, Maxie's tone, we worked out quite early on that Maxie's flow is quite old school. It wasn't sort of fast and dexterous, but it was the content of what he was saying that was important. So where you put space in a piece of music is really important. Having something spacious rather than kind of cluttered and everything's vying for attention. That was something that I would say, Rollo is the producer. I'm really into the detail and nitty-gritty, and I can be one of those people that gets bogged down because I can hear riffs and parts that kind of tessellate and fit. So I could put in 50 different riffs into a song because each riff would inspire another one. And then you have to strip it back and think, look, what is the point of this song? What is the piece of music that connects emotionally? So Rollo's really good at that. So I'd write lots of stuff and he would sift through it and just pull things out often. And I got better and better at producing, so he could hear what I was getting at. But as a musician, I would say the wonderful thing about working with a producer who can't actually play an instrument is that he'll pull me out of going too muso. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, people going muso means you just play over everything and you're riffing away and you're noodling, and it's like, actually, you're just creating a big old happy, exorbitant mess. But that's not necessarily going to be a refined piece of music. So we were always about what is at the heart of this track. And especially with the dance music, it was always about the balance of the beats, the grooves, the spaciousness of it, and the tempo that it was at. Music got faster and faster, and we knew we wanted DJs to play our music, but it was all getting really speedy and kind of, how do we make it sound slow and have gravitas at 136 BPM? So there were certain technical challenges on various different albums at different times, because dance music is one of those things that goes through big sort of trends as a different plug-in gets discovered. Suddenly you've got a speed garage. Suddenly you've got bass lines dominating. Suddenly you've got EDM with the drop. So there are all these kind of tropes which change year by year. This year it's the year of Fred again. It's a gated vocal. I mean, we've been through that in the trance years back in the 90s, but beep, 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 beep is the sound. And little chopped up vocals. It's when Ableton people discover little tricks. Suddenly it's on 100 records. We had that with the pizzicato sound in Insomnia and Salvamere. Suddenly there were a rash of records across Europe that copied our sound. And it forced us to move forward in our production and go, we can't do that sound again. It's done.
Right, which is the perfect time to... Let's hear a little bit about this, or let's hear a little bit of this absolutely mammoth global smash, Insomnia by Faithless. Let's have a listen to that.
I can't get no sleep.
That's brilliant, isn't it? What a classic! What a classic that is. So, let's talk a little bit about the production and the songwriting on that record. So, for example, the riff there. Can you remember how that came about, by any chance?
I have to say, the thing about Insomnia was it was so casual. There was no way we could have known that this was the record that would have gone absolutely bonkers. We'd done Salvamere, that actually has a big pizzicato riff in it, and then we decided to make the album Reverence, and we needed another dance song to balance Salvamere. So Insomnia was using the same palette of sounds, but it was a bit more accessible, because we thought Salvamere was so uncompromising with this weird slow hip-hop bit in the middle and then coming out the other side and dark lyrics about underneath my skin I'm screaming. That's the lyric for Salvamere. And Insomnia was... It literally was, I was DJing every night of the week. I came down the studio and I said, right, we've got to do a song called Insomnia. I can't sleep. I'm in terrible trouble sleeping. Maxie sort of scratched his chin and went away and wrote. We said, look, we need a couple of verses. There is actually a lost verse of Insomnia that nobody knows, which we couldn't fit in. So somewhere there is another verse that has never seen the light of day. Anyway, we only needed 16 bars or 32 bars or whatever it was. And Rollo said, do a riff. So I was just mucking about, and the riff came out, and then he put some strings on. And the kind of grandeur of the strings at the beginning is actually, they're probably going to get sued now, but I sort of pinched it off of Donna Summer around the same time when maybe our Faithless music was sitting on a shelf. I was making music with Adamski, who was a kind of keyboard wizard and one of the early proponents of house music. And I remember him... We're working on a track together, and he said, what is it about these strings? And he was playing me Donna Summer's I Feel Love, which is a seminal dance track, and the strings go from major to minor. There was this sort of mood in it. For some reason, the conversation I'd had with Adam was in my head, and Rollo said, put some strings in and just sort of make it classically, because you do classical music. And that was it. I played real piano on the track. There's all these sort of runs and arpeggios. And then basically he was like, can you hurry up? Because where the garden shed was in Islington in London was near a second-hand record shop called Reckless Records, and we wanted to go and look for some records. He goes, come on, we've got to go record shopping. So literally I sort of put the rudiments of the track down in the afternoon, and off we went. Another inspiration for Insomnia, one of my heroes is a DJ called Justin Robertson. Is he actually from Nottingham? Is he from Nottingham? He's definitely from up north.
Yeah, I think Manchester, maybe.
Maybe it's Manchester. He certainly made his name in Manchester, but he made a seminal record called Lion Rock, which was a great sort of reggae house track. And I was always thinking about Justin Robertson just got great bass lines in his track. So I was thinking about Justin Robertson when I was doing the bass line for Insomnia. So I just laid all the parts down. I did a riff, did a bass line, and then we did different mixes of it before we ended up on the one that became the monster mix, as it's known, the main mix.
And did you have the sound at for that main riff at the same time as you wrote it, or did you
Yes, because we'd used it on Salva Mia.
So you just had it.
Rollo said, we need the first album was so eclectic. There were only two real people think, Faithless dance band. Actually, there was only two banging tracks on that album. There was kind of funky stuff, ambient stuff, a bit of opera, a Dido singing like a kind of little trip hop song. I mean, it was all over the place. I mean, really, if you'd taken it into a record company, said, obviously, I've got this Buddhist rapper, got a producer, and this kind of house DJ that's classically trained and plays the keys, and they've done this record that is just, it doesn't sit in one pigeonhole. They would have just laughed us out the building. Hence, we released it ourselves because I don't think anyone was interested. And in those very early days, Reverence only sold 16 copies a week. And we thought that was amazing. Like, who are these people? 16 copies a week.
I think you've hit on something there, and I think that sometimes it's the role of record labels to not give people stuff that they want, but something that they don't know that they want yet.
Oh, I love that, yeah. But who will take that kind of risk? And that's what independent labels are for. The record labels sort of want the thing that's familiar and that they know it will sell to a particular market.
Yeah.
And we were just on the cusp of dance music suddenly going mainstream. We were told when we had a radio plugger who took Insomnia, the radio edit, to Radio 1, and we were told there was no hook and there was no chorus. But we knew that record was building in the clubs. And it was actually Pete Tong, who's still had a dance show on Radio 1, who campaigned for us to re-release it. He was like, I'm telling you, I'm getting requests all the time for this tune. And within that period, so we released Insomnia twice. It wasn't a hit first off, amazingly. What had happened was, because we were on an independent label, we licensed our album all around Europe to labels who really wanted it. So it wasn't on Universal for England, Germany, Scandinavia. Every territory, it was on a different label. And all those labels were passionate about the record and they really promoted it.
Am I right in thinking Germany was one of the markets that started to
We
happen?
were having a hit in Germany before the UK, and we re-imported the success back. That's when we decided to re-release the record, and then it went top 2 or top 3. But at that point, you know, we still weren't really selling albums, but we had got a band together when we started to go to the top of the charts. But we really cut our teeth touring in Europe, and were becoming very successful there. And when people said to us, oh, you know, your record's like number 58 in the charts in Germany, and we're like, oh, is that exciting? They're like, no, you don't understand. This is the 4th biggest market in the world. And it just went up and up and up. And I think we sold 2 or 3 million records of Insomnia in Germany alone. It was like one every other second in that period. It was just mad. I mean,
it's quite interesting.
Mind.
One of the biggest breakthrough artists of the last few years, Lewis Capaldi, from what I understand, was signed out of Germany rather than the UK, because the UK labels were like, this isn't going to work, is it? You know, this guy, okay, no, really? But the Germans, I think, were like, no, there's something special here. There's something good.
Yeah,
Don't
we
know
were
whether
very,
they sounded
very lucky.
like that, of course, when they said it.
Yeah.
But you know, and that basically, sort of shows that even if people don't get it at first, like you were saying, the radio people were not really feeling it as a crossover radio record.
But the point of that was they sacked everyone. So at Radio 1 had a complete change around in the management. This is so much about making music and releasing it. Is so much is what you call happenstance. It's just luck and timing. And the world isn't ready for some records, and sometimes it does take a long time for things to kind of germinate and pollinate. Even recently, I'm thinking of the #1 record, the Interplanetary Criminal and the Baddest of Them All. You know, it went viral on TikTok, but it took at least a year, didn't it? And then suddenly it hit critical mass. So we had that experience in the analog world where well, a year after we'd released Insomnia the first time, the people at radio suddenly realised they should be playing dance music because that's what young people were listening to, and that they were really missing a trick by just keeping it in the specialist shows. So for the first time in however long, dance music hit daytime radio. And at that point, and they couldn't ignore, they would look stupid if they didn't play our record because we were having number ones all over Europe. You know, Radio 1 would end up with egg on its face. And now it's interesting because they don't have the monopoly in the same way, because streaming and Spotify and so forth and YouTube and TikTok has captured the hearts and minds of the youth. They don't have quite the same authority as they had. But in those days, if Radio 1 supported your record, it was an extremely big deal. It really was.
Do you remember what sort of technology you were using when you made that first album? Was it just...
Yes, an Atari and tape. So anytime you wanted to edit something, if you had to make a radio edit, to go on the radio, all the music we've had success with is like 8 to 10 minutes long in its original version. I mean, Spotify generation probably couldn't even get their heads around that now. We had to edit them down to 3 minutes 40, which seemed like a butchering job, but you'd literally have a little razor blade and you'd be cutting physical reels of tape. And God forbid you cut in the wrong place, because then the edit would sound shit. We did not go digital until the third album, Outrospective, which spawned We Come One. So our first two albums, Reverence, Sunday 8 p.m, which had the big hit God Is a DJ on it, and various other tunes, all made with an Atari and tape. Very old-fashioned.
So do you? What's more important, the idea or the accompanying sort of technology in terms of creating great records?
Well, I would say with electronic music particularly, the sonics are important. So little sounds, details, whooshes, you know, the incredible soundscapes you can make with synthesizers. And for us, the combination with acoustic music as well. We always had acoustic instruments, but blended with electronic instruments on our album. I think central was a lyrical integrity. Having songs that meant something was the most important thing. And then the next most important thing is making music that will connect and work, you know, with the song, obviously. And then if it was a dance track, it had to work in DJ sets. So that's kind of was my wearing lots of different hats, was making the music and then road testing it in the clubs. And I mean, by the second album, we got much more hung up on it. Like, you know, Insomnia, really, we did different versions of it, but it was sort of made in an afternoon. But we never cut dub plates and went back to the studio. It was done. But with God Is a DJ, we had about 10 different versions of it before we settled on the right one, and I kept playing it until I could see and feel. And Rollo used to come with me and sort of stand at my shoulder, you know, watching people to see if it was getting the reaction we needed. It was that kind of visceral, and only then would we go, that's the final version.
I like that a lot. Brings us on to the topic of your DJ work. Now, it was a bit of a boys' club, wasn't it? The sort of clubland, the big DJs, the big promoters. How was that for you as a woman working in a male-dominated world of DJs and promoters, etc.?
I think I felt, but maybe I've always felt this anyway, that I had to be better than everyone else to prove a point. There were certainly some promoters booking female DJs, but it really was because there was the kind of slightly Dolly Bird aspect to it. There were, we've got female DJs on the lineup, but it was like they were there to be kind of, you know, a bit tokenistic, for want of a better word. And I was someone who was really insanely nerdy and passionate about the music, proper train spotter. I feel I was there when Acid House was born. You know, I tracked down those obscure records like the most ridiculous of train spotters. And, you know, I certainly knew as much. And I practiced so that I wouldn't be shit when I was DJing. It was really important. You know, and people go, oh, God, she can actually mix. Like, well, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've always said this, I think there's been a lot of bias in schools, and girls have not been encouraged towards the sciences and technical things. And it's a real shame because it sets up a lack of confidence. And actually, you know, if you think about how women often multitask in the domestic sphere, and cooking and operating washing machines and whatever you were typically meant to do as a woman, or even being a secretary, you know, using a typewriter. That was the ambitions for women back in the day, was to be a secretary. And lots of careers were closed off. But I think the more visibility you have with female DJs and producers, especially in electronic music, the more you see yourself and think, oh, I could do that. If so-and-so can do that, I can do that. So in one way I benefited because there wasn't that many women. So I was more visible. On the other side, I thought I had to work really, really hard to be accepted and to be, you know, to prove my worth that I really was technically as good. And I do know that I wasn't paid as much as male DJs. And that was even when Insomnia was a massive hit. And I found that out by accident. So there definitely wasn't transparency in wages. And that's, I would say, the same in many, many careers. There is a wage gap, discrepancy, and that's got to change.
Do you think it's like if it's easier to break as a female DJ producer now than at the point that you kind of broke into the mainstream?
It's very hard to know because I'm me and I've only had my experience, but I love that there's a multiplicity of, well, all genders of DJs now getting a lot more visibility. More importantly, there's more conversation about it, what a festival lineup should look like, what diversity should look like, not a tick box exercise, but something that really is, I mean, music's very important. I mean, that's why we're all here, isn't it? And I don't just mean that in a sort of, you know, trying to be profound way, but people have profound life experiences to music. Often people, you know, we live in a very alienating world, and having musical experiences together at a gig, at a rave, it is our community, you know, and often it's the only safe space people have to be together where they don't feel under attack for what they look like, who they are. There is something very, or there has been for me, especially in dance music, very accepting about that community. Like I say, I started on the gay scene, and that's where I met some wonderful female DJs who took me under their wing and looked after me, and I had a lot of fun. And they used to dress me up as well, in proper outfits. So, yeah, you know, I feel that music is that very important thread that does bond us together, and that there are many more female DJs now. I like to think people maybe saw me doing my thing, and other trailblazers back in the day, Rachel Orban, Princess Julia, Danielle and Rochelle from the hardcore
Smoking
days.
Joe?
Smoking Joe, she was my hero. I used to make a pilgrimage to see her DJing at Trade, at Turnmills. She was, in fact, when she, you know, blew up as a DJ, I would fill in for her, and that was, for me, one of the pinnacle moments in my DJ career, was playing that club where people took music so seriously, and A&R people from all over would come and listen to what the DJs at Trade were playing, because they knew watching the reaction of that crowd in that particular club would determine whether records would be hits.
I want to talk about collaborations. So can we have a little listen to a track called Flower Stand Man, which has somebody on vocals who went on to be very famous. So, Dido, tell me about Dido.
Well, so Dido was Rollo's sister. She was always asking if she could come and sing on a track for us. And he would always say, "Go away, you're my annoying little sister." And she was in some sort of kind of indie band at the time with a couple of guys. And I remember hearing a demo and thinking that her voice was the best thing about it. And one day Rollo relented and said she could sing, and that was on our first Faithless track, Salva Maya. She could sing the intro, and he gave her the lyrics, and she did a kind of mournful melody, and he paid her with a curry. She then went on to write her own song, so she was in the band for a bit, and then we also, when we came to do the album, we did a song called Flower Stand Man, which was about a really sexy boy selling flowers in Highbury and Islington Station that she had a crush on. And obviously made her forget about the ozone layer disappearing, you know, the end of our species, because she loved him so much. Anyway, so we did this kind of funny song on our first album, Flower Stand Man, and she was like a backing singer in the band, and she sang on Salva Mare and various other tracks on our first album. And meanwhile, she was writing music for her first album. And she got signed as a solo artist and went stratospheric. But since then, she featured on pretty much all our Faithless albums so far, apart from a couple.
So could you tell that this person was going to be a star?
No, absolutely not. What was interesting was she looked good on screen, but our record label that was co-owned by Rollo, who was in the band, was also another parent label called Champion Records. That was a kind of parent label of Cheeky Records, and the head honcho of that, Mel, when he saw Dido singing and he saw her on a screen at a gig that had sort of screens all around the club on our very first Faithless tour, and he said, "When I look at you, I see dollars." And actually he was right. And they went on to sort of, it sounds like groom her to be a star. So she lost a bit of weight and she had good hair, and she'd done this really beautiful song called Breathe, and then she'd started writing an album with Rollo, and various people in the band in Faithless did keys and guitar, and she sort of borrowed some people in the band to play along on the first album. And she got sampled by Eminem on the infamous song Stan, and it just blew up. I mean, it wasn't just one thing. She was working really hard, gigging and trying to get a fan base that way, but there were a few moments where you know there's a synergy where something is actually connecting in music. We've had it a few times for our music. And I remember it very specifically for Dido, as her music was synced, as in synchronised on a film called Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow. She had some music on a series called Roswell High, and she got sampled by Eminem. And then she got MTV rotation for her video. So there were all these different things happening at the same time, and you could feel this wave. And then suddenly she became the biggest selling female artist of the decade. It was extraordinary. She kind of left us in the dust.
Isn't it interesting that, you know, you get that when you've been able to see, you know, not only your own band, because you're part of it, and you know how that felt before you had success, but then somebody else sort of close by.
Yeah,
it's
someone
really
like
interesting.
A collaborator. It was, what we did realise was it was a great springboard. So we would bring other artists on board to collaborate with the band. Maxi is the central spine of Faithless, his message, his Buddhist philosophy, the agenda and his lyrics. And then we choose different people to work with, sort of singers, who'd either sort of contrast or complement what he was doing, either with, you know, really beautiful voice or, you know, kind of really, again, people with a lyrical agenda who had something to say. We collaborated with an artist from Nottingham, in fact, who had done some beautiful work with a chill-out band called Bent, who are also from Nottingham. You should check them out. Their music's absolutely beautiful. She's called Zoe Johnston. She does a lot of work with Above and Beyond now. She was on our third album. And it really was like a platform. By then, we were playing to hundreds of thousands of people, doing massive tours. And then people were interested because of the Dido effect, like, who's this female singer with Faithless? So it was kind of really lovely to give a platform to people who were, you know, further down the kind of musical rung, and elevate them and bring them to a new audience. And I believe that's kept the band fresh. You know, we've only been around 30 odd years, I would say, because we don't do the same record every time, and we bring different voices in to join the conversation.
Can that sometimes
be very important?
Can it sometimes be a bit challenging though when you bring people in that they're, you know, have you ever had difficult sessions where you've sort of had let's you know, collab and see if it works, and you go, whoa, this person's just really not getting what we're about, and it's difficult? Or have you been fortunate, and when have you selected carefully, and when you've collaborated with people, it's generally sort of fallen into place quite easily?
Yeah, I would say we choose carefully. There's been sessions where we've worked with people and it hasn't gone on the album, but that's often because sometimes as an album is growing, it's a very organic process, sometimes the album starts off, you think it's going to be about something, and as the sessions progress, actually the nature of what you're talking about and what you want to say becomes really different, and then the subject matter in the song just doesn't fit, just doesn't work. So then for me, it's like doing a giant Jenga puzzle. You know, Jenga, where you have to insert these little blocks. It's like a puzzle. When you don't just have a singer and the singer sings every single song on the album, when you're working and collaborating with different voices, how do they weave in and out? How do they work together? How do they, have, melody, gravitas, nuance? What's their message? Do we need a big chorus here? Is that too much of that rap? Is it just endless rap? Is the rap just getting on my tits now? I need to change it up. Do you know what I mean? That's what happens when you make, as we have done, albums. It's quite a laborious process, and that's pretty much the only time I would say where you're just like, that session, the song was lovely, but it didn't work. I've never really come out of a session thinking, God, that was just so awful. That person was hateful.
Yeah, no.
Thank God.
Like you said, you've selected carefully. I think I see a parallel between something you said earlier and something you said just then. So earlier you were saying that you were coming up with riffs, and sometimes in the studio, you do a whole bunch of riffs, and maybe Rollo...
Love a riff.
And don't we all? And maybe Rollo would go, oh, no, that's the good one. And then when you're talking about collaborating, making an album, again, you're trying out, you're doing different sessions, making different songs, and you've got to do that process to end up with the cream, haven't you? The stuff that is of the very best quality. So when it's not surprising that you do sessions and maybe they don't make the record, but it's kind of like that's one of the things you have to do to make the best possible record, isn't it? What I'm kind of getting at here is the necessity of doing stuff.
Yeah, even if it doesn't work, something
get you
might
somewhere
come out
else,
of it.
Right?
Yeah, definitely. So that's what I would say to anyone making music is just try it. Don't be paralysed with fear and think, oh my God, this record is the one. You have to make lots. It is practice. It's also the law of averages. The more you make, the more you have to choose from, the more likely something might connect. You hone your craft. It could happen on the first record. It might happen on the 100th record. It might never happen. But each time you go into the studio, you become more confident. You become better at finding a language with which to speak to the people that you're collaborating with, whether it's a musical language or it's about lyrics or, I always think it's very important to talk about where you're at personally. I would say that each of our albums are a snapshot of something that was going on in our lives at the time, even if it was kind of subconsciously. And especially if I work with singers, I really like, if I'm on a session with someone I don't know very well, it's really good to just chat. No pressure to just get in there and write a song, but chat about what's going on for them in their lives and think, could this be something that could inspire a song? Obviously, making up and breaking up is a good subject matter, but so is being angry about the state of the nation. I mean, for me, politics and music are quite happy bedfellows. Sometimes it's really cringy if it's not done right, but I think there's a huge space in music to protest about the world we find ourselves living in and the way opportunities are cut off for people. There's great lyrical juice in that, and sometimes it does my head in when there's so much music that just isn't about anything. So thank God for Sleaford Mods, who'll be here on Thursday.
Exactly.
Nottingham's finest, come on.
Yes, lads.
Yeah.
I think this is really important stuff. Nile Rodgers actually said that one of the important things in the studio is sort of being a bit stupid, putting forward an idea that, like, maybe this isn't any good. Maybe this idea is really shit, but I'm just going to throw it in the pot anyway. And being brave enough to do that with your collaborators, because if it is a shit idea, that's okay. There might be something within it. Maybe it's a 10-second idea, but there might be something in it that takes the collaborators somewhere else, off, from there, and then that might be brilliant. So he said that a lot of the the magic comes kind of in the editing. So the studio isn't a place to just go, right, I've got these very defined, perfect bits, let's go. He was like, let's throw a bunch of ideas in, and then you that's not quite good enough. We don't need that. That's brilliant. Have you found that where you might have been writing one song, for example, and then you've found like a really good bit, the rest of the song was okay, but there was one really good bit, and then have you then used that in something else?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there is, I think, again, the kind of essence of what you're saying is, and which I completely agree with, in all areas of life, is feel the fear and do it anyway. Because if you don't, dare greatly and venture out there and fail and get knockbacks, you just don't grow as an artist, as a communicator, as a person. I actually heard a really interesting interview on the radio with Errol Alkan, who's an amazing producer and DJ, and how he had stuff on his hard drive that's at least 10 years old that he comes back to. And I'm a bit like that, where I go through phases depending on how I'm feeling, where I think everything is just rubbish. And then I'll come back to it when I'm in a different frame of mind and go, do you know what, the bass line on that's quite good. Or I'll take that out and let me rejig it, maybe change the tempo, change the key, and suddenly it becomes a completely different piece of music.
Or maybe the market has changed. So
you like need different beats or different production tropes to make it not sound dated.
At the time that you did it was a misfire, it couldn't have worked. 2 years later, tempos have changed, this, that and the other. Oh, actually, sounds more current now than it did when you wrote it 2.5 years ago. I think that's something that we sometimes see. So again, in terms of my encouragement, it's do stuff, get stuff done, lay it down. You never know, it could be useful in 2 years, 5 years.
Absolutely, it's a great advice. I would also say that music can live beyond being an artist and being in a band. You can end up doing music for gaming, TV, film scores. There is a really rich scene where people that often don't necessarily make it in a band or an artist, or they're signed for a bit and then they're dropped, and they find their feet in the world of TV advertising or jingle writing. You can make a living out of music in a lot of different ways. So I say you can write songs, but keep an instrumental of them in your hard drive, for example. It might, come to pass that you use it in a completely different platform or different environment that you'd ever imagined. Because that's what happened in my life, as well as doing music with Faithless. I make music for TV, film scores, theatre. It's all happened because I've had lucky enough to have a sort of calling card with my albums. But I mean, that wasn't a guarantee that I would know how to write music for TV, but I was offered an opportunity and I was scared shitless, but I went with it.
So when you've composed for film, for example, what's the main difference between being a composer for film to making a record as an artist?
Well, it doesn't have to be a hit. Thank God. It doesn't have to be on the radio. It's not on an album necessarily. It can be on an original soundtrack album, but it's not making an album for your artist album, which you will then have to be touring for 18 months. You are there in service of the director and the picture. And you're there writing music with visual cues. It's a really lovely way to work. I mean, a lot of people have said Faithless's music is so cinematic. It lends itself to the drama of cinema. So I suppose there's something that connected me to that. I love film, love TV. I mean, who doesn't? So, and it's interesting when you start writing music for TV and film, how you start listening in a different way. I mean, what's also interesting is so many people in bands now compose music for films. I've been to see a few films and thought, my God, the music was great. Of course, it's always Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead. It's his world and we just live in it. I'm waiting to be as successful as Johnny Greenwood. Or when he's bored and tired and he says, would you like to do this project? But, Nick Cave as well, another amazing actual artist who not only composes for film but writes his own screenplays as well. It's amazing to watch people blossom in this way and enjoy the process. It's all creativity. And I love collaborating. Back to what you said about collaborating, whether it's with directors or editors or actual artists, singers, rappers, producers. It's all about relationships. It's all about having good chat with people and, finding a shared vision. It's a very enjoyable process.
You've had great success as a live act as well. I'd like to just play a little clip of We Come One. I think this is live at Glastonbury, and then we'll talk about live, if that's okay.
Sure is.
So tell us about Faithless Live. What are the challenges of taking a record out of the studio and presenting it in front of tens of thousands of people?
Well, so in the studio, it's just me, Rollo and Maxi. And how do you make this music that's sort of multi-tracked? It's me playing everything. Then how do we make it sound rich and alive in the live context? And Maxi was very definite. He didn't want to just be on the mic with a DJ playing an instrumental behind him, because he'd done that. He'd done some hip-hop tracks, and he didn't want to go down that path. In those days, it was what was called a DAT tape. You know, so there were lots of people doing what you call live PAs, which was, you know, sometimes not even doing the vocal live, but just sort of miming over a tape. So he was the one that kind of propelled us into getting a band together. So some of the people that had performed on the first Faithless album, some session musicians, came on board, and we kind of made this strange, I would say almost hybrid experience, where it didn't sound quite like the record, it alluded to it, but was an experience in and of itself. With, well, at that time it was 10 musicians. I don't know what we were thinking. I mean, we didn't pay ourselves for the first 5 years because we had to pay the band. And then we honed
That's interesting.
And then we honed it to 8. We got rid of a couple of people. We couldn't even fit on stage. It was so ridiculous. But it was that we didn't have sort of Ableton Live and all the things you have now to kind of run things electronically. So we were playing everything live. And then we discovered how to do triggering. We used an MPC, which was a kind of sequencer to run the beats, because in dance music, the beats have to be very metronomic. You know, and the sound of the kick drum, it wouldn't work if it was just an acoustic kick. But what I think we did, again, totally by accident, was this layering of acoustic instruments and electronic instruments, and you didn't know where one thing started and another thing ended. And it created a really exciting sonic palette and texture, but it was also very, very visceral, in a way that when you listen to an album, it has lots of texture and layers. And we soon realised if you put those things in a live scenario, they get lost. And the crowd gets lost. And when you listen to an album, you can just listen to it again and again. You can listen to it loud, on headphones, in the car, doing the hoovering, in the gym. The live experience is there, and then it's gone. Of course, now everyone's got phones, and then you watch it again and again on YouTube. But when we started, you were in the moment, in that gig.
That's all you were getting.
Yeah, so we learnt quite early on to sort of strip the songs back to their essence and rebuild them. So if you came to a Faithless Live show, you weren't getting a carbon copy of the record just turned up loud. You were getting, in this essence, a sort of bespoke remix experience. With all the intensity of watching really good musicians play real instruments. And there was something about the way we connected. I mean, became a really tight band because we just did so many gigs, because there was no internet. How do you let people know that you exist? You have to go to their town. You have to go to their radio station. You have to sign some albums in a shop, and then you have to do a gig. And then people will say, God, did you see Faithless last night? Then it gets in the press, and then the press spread the word, and then you might be on telly. I mean, that was what existed to allow the world to know that. I said I'd walk up and down the street with a sandwich board on, telling people that we had an album out. But, you know, now at the click of a button, you can reach millions and millions of people. It's a really different environment.
Did you find that there were, that you know, when you're out on the road, did things go smoothly? Did you sometimes have difficult challenges, or did sometimes things go wrong? Or
Yes, many, many, many things went wrong. We were utterly chaotic. We didn't have any management. We had a tour manager who wasn't actually a tour manager. He was a glorified guitar tech. He elevated himself to a position of tour management, but was completely incompetent. I have no idea how we got to and from our gigs. Well, I do know we carried all our own gear. So it wasn't like people setting it up. We had to set up our own stage shows. It was a real DIY operation. We were so disorganised, we once left the percussionist in a different country. He got off the tour bus.
Some would say that's the best place for him or her.
Harsh. He didn't tell the driver he needed the toilet. We stopped to get petrol. Everyone was asleep. Got off the bus in his pyjamas. Driver didn't know. Didn't realise till sound check.
Oh, wow.
Where is he?
Still
We
in the
thought he was in
service?
his bunk. He wasn't on the bus. Oh, my
Bless him.
God. And it traced back what had happened, thinking, this is really weird. How could he have disappeared? He had no money. He was in his pyjamas. And we'd
God.
gone over a border between Germany
Oh
and
my
Switzerland, and
God.
the promoter had to send a car. Thank goodness there was like 3 hours between sound check and the doors opening. And they went and fished him out of this fucking service station in his PJs.
Unbelievable.
Poor Mal. I do feel guilty about that.
And-
but nobody knew. So
and-
first rule of touring, you've got to tell someone when you get off the bus.
And you mentioned when we were just chatting briefly before, passports getting sent to the wrong country or something, something along those lines.
Oh, people not turning up for flights. We had a singer turning up and got on the wrong bus to go to Glastonbury. She got the time 12 hours wrong.
Right.
And just got on a bus. They said they were going to Glastonbury, even though she knew it didn't look like the right band.
She got on. Hold on. She got on a different band's bus.
She got on a different band's bus. Yes.
Okay.
At least we all ended up in the same place, but she was 12 hours early. So yeah, all sorts of sort of silly things. And of course, if you do tour as intensively as we did, it becomes a family, and it is extremely intense going through different time zones, having the huge highs of the gigs and then the lows of the after gigs, coming back into real life when you've missed your friends, families, celebrations. You're never there. If you're the entertainment, you're not going to that wedding. You're missing a lot of what goes on in life, and I think that can be very difficult for artists. There was a great camaraderie on our tour, but there were also huge rows, and it wasn't like when you could go home and go, God, my boss was a wanker. And, you couldn't go home and complain to people, just to live with them and see them the next day and go on stage and be this very well-drilled unit, but also promoting a message of peace and love. You had to...
That must be hard if you'd been having a massive bust-up just before.
Well, quite. I mean, the amazing thing was, because Maxi had this Buddhist wisdom, he was like the sort of dad of the group and I was like the mum, there was this kind of, deep respect and a deep kind of thinking about problem solving and how we are as human beings and how to go through those difficult times. But sometimes it could be quite fractious and exhausting. When people are tired and they've been through 8 different time zones, you don't even know what country you're in, it can be really, really difficult. But I mean, I have to say, the music came before everything, before any inter-band fractiousness. The music and the fact that people had paid hard-earned money to come and see us, that was the most important thing. There's nothing, the fans, that's it. It is for them. And we must put aside. And this is a metaphor for living life in a peaceful way and not promoting war. If you cannot sort arguments out on a tour bus in a band, what hope have we got? So there was a kind of another level to how we tried to sort of problem solve just the difficulty of being up close in a box 24 hours a day for several weeks or months at a time.
We could keep talking for hours, I think, but I'm conscious I'd quite like to do a couple of questions from the audience, if that's possible. Is that going to be something that we can do? How long have we got to do some Q&A here? 8 minutes. Okay.
Super.
So perhaps we can... Has anybody got a question that they would like to ask Blissy? If so, make yourself known.
Hello, how are you doing?
Hello there.
Just want to start off by saying thank you so much for your art. I think everyone else can agree with me that your music has made such an just humongous impact on so many people's lives. And I think a lot of people will agree with me by saying that the Insomnia riff is possibly up there with Kashmir and Seven Nation Army as possibly one of the best riffs of all time. Just
Very kind.
Yeah, right.
Oh, thank you.
There you go, they agree as well.
Led Zeppelin, come on.
But yeah, and so my main... No, it's all right, they agree as well. So yeah, my question really sort of revolves around the sort of culture of that rave scene that you grew up with. I heard someone say recently that rave culture seemed to be mainly one of the last organic sort of music cultures that sort of, grew and exploded. You don't really see that, unfortunately, nowadays with sort of everything being online. But what do you think made that rave scene just so organic and so new and so massive for so many people that might be lacking now?
I guess because you had to be in the moment. It wasn't about documenting it on smartphones. It's not a criticism. I do it myself. But I guess it was also, everything is born of culture, cultural and political life that was going on at the time. The background of Thatcherism, her politics, and she was saying there's no such thing as society, people losing their livelihoods, buildings becoming derelict where there was once factories and life, and people came and put their own communities in it. So there was a kind of reaction to Thatcherism. There's no other way of putting it, really. I think dance music, especially in this country, evolved in a way that was quite different from America, because I went to America in 1989 because I was so insanely passionate about house music. And I was like one of the only white people and female in the clubs that I went to. It was very black, it was Hispanic, it was gay, it was utterly marginalised. And dance music in the UK had a very, very different energy, even though I'd first heard it on the gay scene in gay clubs. And I hadn't heard it in the mainstream until the sort of Summer of Love, a little bit later. But I think this sort of cultural environment is extremely important. And of course it was also very regional. It wasn't just about London, it was about Manchester, it was about Nottingham. There were all these little scenes. There was DIY, actually a collective from here, the DIY aspect I talked about. The DIY collective. There were people who felt ostracised from society, like, you're telling us we're not society, fuck you, we'll make our own. So I think there was a slightly subversive element to it. And of course, it combined with these sort of importing of ecstasy and this huge wave of people wanting to connect and feel love and oneness where they had felt so alienated from each other. So perhaps that was what maybe a bit different about the rave then and the rave now. But I also think we're tribal people. Since the beginning of time, we've danced around a fire and probably taken some hallucinogenic something or other and, worshipped the gods or worshipped each other or whatever it was, or prayed for rain and our crops to do well.
Absolutely.
With big bowls of peyote, depending on where you were, and, in the Mayan ruins of Peru or over here.
I agree. It's been
look at Stonehenge. I mean,
getting together and celebrating life and
absolutely, we are communal people.
We are.
So I think house music came out of this kind of perfect storm of a political situation, an advance in electronics, a particular drug that brought a sense of community. And a pretty shitty time in Britain's politics. Feels like we're reliving it now, but worse, to be fair.
Is there another question from somebody? Yeah?
Such nice clubby lighting, isn't it?
Hello.
I can't see anyone.
It's not too loud. Hi.
Hey.
Do you feel as if you might have a perfectionist personality?
Yes, it's awful. Drive myself mad. Yes.
Do you overdo it, work too hard on things that you think might need to come out
Oh my God, he knows me.
Well, I'm the same.
Yeah,
so
I do. A bit less now because I've got a 16-year-old, so I just can't be as dogged and as ambitious and sort of workaholic as I once was, because I have to look after another human being. Annoying though it is. Yes, I am a perfectionist, and it can be my own worst enemy. And I did spend quite a lot of time in the band, like not enjoying it, not enjoying the success, feeling that I wasn't worthy of it. I would also say, for people in music, there's something that's often spoken about mental health, about imposter syndrome. And I felt that for a really long time. I always thought it's everyone else that's clever and successful and brilliant. It's me, it's Maxi, it's Rollo, it's not me. It took me a long time to actually integrate that actually, I did do those riffs, and I did do all the music and have some sort of ownership of it, because in my mind I could only hear what was wrong with it. But there has to be some perfectionist in the band. Rollo's all about the big brush strokes, and I'm about the sort of insane detail.
It's like the best of both worlds, isn't it? It's like different
we
sides.
complemented each other. We each had our areas, and we worked so well for such a long time.
Brilliant brain by drawing down on the best of everything that's around you.
Yeah, definitely. But I think being a perfectionist is a good thing in a way and a bad thing in a way. It can really hold you back, because you've got to... Rollo is very good at going, it's finished. Let's just let it go. Let's let it go. At some point, you have to send the kid out into the world. He might get mugged. He might get a hug. You just can't know. But this is the risk in any creative endeavour. there's a lot of fear involved, and maybe perfectionism is part of actually fear, a hanging on. So don't hang on. My advice to you is, let's see what other people think as well. Get some affirmation from outside. Play your music to your mates, and if they go, you know what, that's wicked, or beats are a bit lame, mate, can you make it, do something with your hi-hats.
Maybe we've got time for one more question if somebody from the audience wants to ask one more, perhaps this lady here. And then I've got one question myself to wrap things up. Can we get a microphone to our friend down here?
Have you ever been through burnout, and if so, how have you dealt with it?
That's a great question. I don't know if I've ever burnt out. I've definitely had really low points. Like I say, there's a lot of sacrifice in going around the world again and again and again. Your relationships suffer. There's been a lot of heartbreak and difficult times. Burnout, I think there was always a point where we would stop touring and we would know. But I think because I'm a creative person, I actually found being in the studio, even if the music I was making wasn't very good, I never felt that kind of sense of burnout, like I have to just stop. So, yeah, I would say the thing is that I just find listening to music really inspiring as well. So if I got close to that point, I would try and slow down. It's very hard if you're in a touring cycle. You just can't stop. That is the point where you get burnt out. But again, the more successful we got, the better we got at pacing ourselves so that we didn't burn out. And we did get to a point, because Maxi was older, he said, I will only do 15 gigs this summer. And they had to be the biggest and best, because he knew that his health was finite and he was getting really exhausted, because the shows were long, they're intense, they're demanding, they're passionate. We always gave 110%. So we definitely got better at pacing ourselves, and making sure we didn't hit burnout. It's very difficult. Suddenly, when everyone in the world wants you, you want to be everywhere at once. I remember we flew to 3 different countries in one day, and we were just completely discombobulated. It was absolutely bonkers. But that's what success feels like. It's very exciting, but that's when you're, I suppose, the greatest danger. There's a lot of talk about it, isn't there? Like Arlo Parks has stopped, and there's Justin Bieber's got health issues at the moment, because you just can't be everything to everyone. So you have to start to prioritise. And that's where I would say management. Good people looking after you. So you don't end up like Avicii, absolutely strung out mentally, emotionally and physically. And that's an absolute tragedy for someone so talented. So yeah, it's good to have good people around you who can spot when you're not doing well. Because you might think, I can keep going, but actually you've gone mad. You've lost the plot.
My final question, and the final question of the session, is if you could have a conversation with that 19-year-old buying that Atari, thinking, I'd like to sort of make some house music back in, that time when you, bought your first bit of kit there in Camden Town. What advice would you give that young person from the perspective that you come from today?
Oh, wow. That's a good one. I think, what advice would I give? That's so weird. I feel like I'm in Back to the Future, like having a Marty McFly moment. What advice would I give? I think the advice, just keep on keeping on. Because it's, if you want longevity in this business, you have to just keep trying. But I did, so I've given myself that advice anyway.
Fantastic.
Don't give up. Don't give up.
Thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you for joining us today. Sister Bliss.
Thank you so much.